Okay, great. All right, so the webinar is now being recorded. So what we're going to do here, a real quick agenda, we're going to go through just a couple of slides of database connector information, just so you have an idea of what the database connector does and how it works, and then go through some examples. One of the examples is, the first example is a dynamic pick list, one of the most common scenarios that customers encounter. I want to create a pick list whose selection items are, or options are dynamically generated from a SQL query. The second example will be a dependent pick list. And that's very similar to the original dynamic pick list, except that there's a second pick list whose options dynamically change depending upon what value was picked in the first one. We'll follow that up with a master detail type of example using XML schema, so you have an idea of how to use the database connector to look at to create really forms that are pretty complex. The content that's being rendered from the database is complex, large, might have repeating items, et cetera, et cetera. And then we'll have some time for questions. Just a little bit of housekeeping. In your GoToWebinar control panel, you should see a panel, something similar here. You'll have a few fewer panes in here, but there should be a questions pane. You can type your question in there. My colleague Courtney is also here on the webinar. If there are any questions that she can answer or she thinks should be answered directly out there, she can answer you directly in the chat window itself, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for asking a few questions and answering those as well. Okay, so jumping right in, one thing is this is going to be a fairly technical webinar. So this is not just, we're not just going to do a marketing type of webinar. We'll be doing things with XML, XML schema, SQL, obviously, JSON, JavaScript, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to really dive into how the database connector is used, create some example forms using some of these technologies. So it's a pretty technical webinar. So the first thing is, what are customers using the database connector for? We already talked about the first two things, dynamic dependent pick lists are one of the most common use cases. We're going to look at that. Master detail relationships. Examples are line items for a sales order, which is an example we're going to see, and then customer details. So I pick a customer, want to see all the detailed information about that customer. This is an example that we'll try to see if we have time to take a look at as well, but if not, it's available on our website as well. The DB connector can also be used to create and or update records. So for example, you can create a brand new customer entry or order. You can also update, if you consider the line items for a sales order, you can go find a sales order. Let's say it has 20 line items. You could delete a couple, add a couple, update 5 of them, and the database connector will do the right thing. It'll update the database table or the database records for those entries that were changed. It will create new ones for those that were added, and it will remove the records for those that were deleted. It's possible to set that up as well. You can also run stored procedures from the database connector. You can also technically run delete queries through the database connector. However, no one actually does that. I'm not aware of a single customer that actually uses a frevvo form to delete information from their database. Okay, how does it work? It's just a very basic picture here. Frevvo, as many of you know, is a RESTful application, which means it talks either XML or JSON over HTTP, and that's all that Frevvo itself knows how to do. So we have a number of these connectors that essentially translate between either of these formats, XML, XSD, or JSON, and the format that's used to access the backend system. In this case, since it's a database, you can, the database connector on one side talks XML, XSD, or JSON over HTTP, and on the other side talks SQL. There are other examples of connectors, SharePoint connector, Box connector, file system connector, etc. The Frevvo side to the connector is exactly the same, except on the other side, they'll use the appropriate technology for that particular system. Thank you. The database connector has configuration. So I'm just going to take a quick look at this. This is extensively documented in the tutorial, but I just want to give you a real quick look. There's a query set in the configuration of the database connector. It has a name, so I've put that in red over there. We'll see why a little bit later. This example we're using has the name BIRT, B-I-R-T. And then there are a few other things in there, the URL that's used to actually connect to the database. For example, where's the database server running, the name of the database, classic models, username, password, et cetera, et cetera. It essentially specifies which database are you trying to connect to and what are the credentials to connect to that database. Supports multiple query sets in here. You can have any number of these query set parameters in the configuration. Okay. The other thing that you obviously need to be able to do is to define an actual SQL query. So queries have names in the configuration of the database connector. In this example here, the name is all customers, and the query itself is what we call a retrieve query. It's a pretty straightforward query. Select customer number, customer name from customers, order by customer name. Pretty straightforward. In this case, retrieve query maps to an HTTP GET, and there are other queries which map to other HTTP methods, which we'll talk about in a second. Let's take a look at the query itself. So I happen to have the database here, and I can run that query. So here's the query. We don't need this limit in here. And I'm going to run the query, and you'll see that we get back a list of customers ordered by customer name. And of course, you get the customer number as well. Let's see how many rows there are. There are 122 rows that were returned by this query. So in this particular sample database, we got 122 customers. Okay. So that's the actual database query we ran against the database. Now, how does that work with frevvo and the database connector? So since the database connector is I'm sorry, a brief segue into this. So the DB connector is a web application. As you know, as I already mentioned earlier, frevvo talks HTTP. So on the frevvo side, it is expecting to get an HTTP request. And there's a very straightforward mapping between the HTTP methods and the SQL CRUD operations. HTTP GET maps to retrieve, which is essentially select queries. The HTTP POST maps to create, the PUT maps to updates, and the delete maps to delete queries. Very simple, very easy to set that up with frevvo. We'll be looking at how we use that information as well. So here's an example of that query we just talked about. We had that query called all customers earlier. We just ran this query against the SQL database. How do we put all of these parts together to create something that the database connector can use? Remember, the database connector is expecting an HTTP GET query in order to run a select statement. So the query is constructed very easily. It's pretty straightforward. Remember, we had a query set with a name. The name was Bert. That's in red up there. The query has a name called all customers in blue here. And you construct the query according to this, essentially the syntax here. It's an HTTP or HTTPS query with the server. The server is wherever the database connector is running, /database/ the name of Bert, directly copied from the query set, and all customers, which is the name of the query itself. So very easy to, very straightforward. Maybe take a couple of attempts to try this out to make sure you get it. But mapping an mapping a query in the database connector configuration to the actual HTTP URL that maps to that query is very straightforward. Again, this is very extensively documented in our database connector tutorial as well as documentation, and I will be pointing you to those at the end of the webinar so you have that information as well. Let's take a look at what happens when we run this query. Okay. Ooh. Not sure what happened there. So I ran this query. Go away. This stupid pop-up is coming up. 1 second. Let me get out of presentation mode here. So in this XML, I clicked on this link and ran this query here. And what you can see here is that the query ran database/Bert/all customers. And what we got back is an XML document. This XML document corresponds exactly to the results of this query. So I think you'll be able to see that it's the same information, 237 A&G resellers, 242 alpha, et cetera, et cetera. And simply an XML representation of that particular query set or a particular result set. The same information can also be obtained from the database connector as a JSON object. and a JSON string. And again, we ran the same query. We just gave it a media type JSON. You got the same information back as a JSON string. In practice, you don't need to really worry about this too much. The database connector, or frevvo, I'm sorry, will automatically send to the database connector a URL with the appropriate media type. So depending on whether you're running this on a business rule where it needs JSON, frevvo knows what it needs to what needs to be done, and it'll make sure that it gets back JSON from the database connector, and wherever it needs XML, it'll do the right thing. So you don't really need to worry about these that specific bit of detail there. Okay, so now that we know how to map these queries to HTTP requests, let's actually create an example. So we're going to create a dynamic pick list, and in this pick list, we're going to create a list of customers. So essentially, we're going to run the above query, or we're going to create a business rule that runs that particular query. It's going to parse the results. The query, since it's running from a business rule, the query will return JSON. We're going to parse the results, and then we're going to, in the business rule, set up the pick list. So let's take a look at how that's done here. I'm going to switch my browser here, and I've got several of these examples pre-created here. So this is a form called list customers, and in this case, all we have here is a single pick list, a drop-down, which we drag and drop from here. And you look in here, the design type options are simply option 1, option 2, and option 3. Just some static content. We'll never actually see this as the options in the pick list when the user actually uses the form. Now, how do we initialize this pick list with the customer information from the database connector query? So as we saw, oh my gosh, this switching is a pain. This is the URL that's used with media type JSON. So we're going to create a business rule. So here's the business rule. It's very straightforward. All that the rule is doing, it's running that same HTTP GET. It's calling issuing an HTTP GET to the exact same URL, BERT/all customers. Since it's running from a rule, you don't need to supply a media type or anything. frevvo will automatically return JSON. The JSON is being parsed using this eval method. And then all we're doing is looping through that result set and saying, we're going to set the options in the pick list to be customer number equals customer name. So essentially what this means is we're going to create a pick list with 237 equals ANG, 187 AV stores, 242 Alpha, Cognac, 168 American souvenirs, etc. Pretty straightforward. Take a look at this example here. Once again, the rule is simply calling that HTTP GET URL, parsing the JSON, running a loop, setting the options of the pick list to whatever is returned by the connector. SC in here is just the name that we gave to that particular control. So if you select this pick list here, you see that the name is SC. And that's all there is to it. Just let's try it out. We'll see that, hopefully at least, we'll see that the pick list is now populated with the list of customers that came by, and that came from the database by executing the SQL query. When you run the form in this test mode, you'll see down here that it is showing you what happened. There's a debug console that appears. This obviously doesn't appear in production, and it's showing you that it was there's a rule called, I guess, show customers. Here's the rule. The rule ran. Here's the get that was issued. HTTP GET. Here are the list of the parsed list of options that are being set in the database connect in the pick list, and that's what we see on the screen in here. So pretty straightforward. Let's go back there. And just to recap this, what we did here, all we did is we created a query in the database connector configuration. We created a business rule. We created an HTTP URL, or essentially mapped that query in the configuration to an HTTP GET. We invoked that HTTP GET from the business rule. We got back JSON, parsed it, and set the options for the pick list to that particular parsed JSON object. And that's all there is to it. A really, really common scenario. Becoming familiar with it is pretty easy. Not a big deal. It's something, as I mentioned, is extremely well documented in our tutorial as well as documentation. So let's take a look at the next example here. This one is a dependent pick list, which means that the query has a where clause. What we're going to do here essentially is create a pair of drop downs or pick list controls in the form, but the data in the second pick list depends on the first. So perhaps this will be easier if I show you the running example first. And this is very similar. We've got the two pick lists here. The first pick list has the list of customers, and the second pick list has a list of orders for that particular customer. Now, obviously, as the customer changes, you want to run a query and fetch the list of orders for that particular customer. So how do you do that? Really simple again. First step in anything to do with the database connector, you got to create a query, a SQL query, or a stored procedure. So we've got a query here. We're going to call it orders by customer. There's the name of the query. And the only difference really between this query and the previous one is that there's a where clause, and where clauses generally have parameters. So we're selecting a list of, we're selecting order number, order date, status, and customer number. So a set of some sort of order information from the table called orders, where customer number equals, this is a template in here, CNUM. So what this means, this is a variable essentially. And what we're going to be doing, what this means essentially is that the HTTP method that's used to invoke the database connector is going to need a parameter. And the parameter is named CNUM. That's what we're telling the connector. So here's how the query, or the URL for that particular, to run this particular query is constructed. Once again, you've got the name of the query set, BERT. You've got the name of the query, orders by customer. But in this particular case, we also have an extra parameter. CNUM equals 242, 249, whatever it is. That's the actual customer number in here. So if we were to run this query in the, let's see, I know I have it somewhere. So let's run this query here. So you see we've got the same query in here, except we've got an order number 10,397. Oh, I'm sorry, I picked the wrong one. Let me get this query from here. And we're going to pick customer number equals whatever, 242, I think. And you see you get a list of order numbers for that particular customer. So this customer has 3 orders, 10,136, 10,178, and 10,397. You can see that exact same information. Hopefully I picked 242 here, yeah. You can see that exact same information here by running the same query from the database connector. So in this case, we're doing an HTTP GET, and the database connector is going off and running the exact same query. I guess these are two different databases. So in this particular database, this customer has more orders. But your bottom line is you're getting a list of orders for that particular customer. What we want to do now is we want to populate the pick list in the form with that information. So how's that done? Let's take a look first in this slide here, just so we have the list of steps. As always with frevvo, the first thing is to, in the database connector, the first thing is to create the query. Once again, we're going to do something really similar to the first example, since it is a pick list, dynamic pick list. We're going to create a business rule that runs that particular query or issues an HTTP GET to the database connector, runs that particular query, returns the results as JSON, parses the results, and sets up the pick list. And the only thing that's really different is that the rule is going to pass the value of this variable called CNUM based on whatever we pick in the first pick list. So what does that mean? Let's take a look again here. Let's edit this form. So we've got the two pick lists. Recall that this particular one is called SC. This particular one is called SO for select order. So we've got names for these things. We've got a pair of business rules. The first one is identical. We're just going to populate the first pick list with a list of customers. The second one is almost identical. The only thing is we're going to issue that HTTP GET again, except this time we need to pass a parameter. We know that the name of the parameter is CNUM. That's what we configured in the query. What is the value of CNUM? Well, it happens to be whatever you selected in the first pick list. And that's the value of the control SC. So hopefully that makes sense. When I select a particular customer in the first pick list, the pick list gets a value. That value is referenced in a rule by sc.value. The value is the number because that's how we set up that pick list. If you remember, the pick list was set up as number equals name. So name is what's displayed, number is the value. We're going to pass that value into this query. It's going to return us a list of orders. We're going to parse that response using the eval, and then we're going to loop through here and set order number equals order number is the value, and this is what the user sees, something a little bit more friendly for the end user to see. And that's all there is to it. Really straightforward. Let's try it out. Remember, the list of options initially is just set to option 1, option 2, and option 3. But when we run this particular form, you'll see that first the rule ran that created that went and fetched all the customers. Let me clear this debug console. Now when I select a customer, a rule will run again. This rule is now returning the list of orders for customer number 242, which is this customer. We got a list of orders there. I select a different customer, say customer number 249, and I get a different set of orders. I guess it's a much shorter list. I've just got 3 orders for this customer. And then you can, obviously the same applies to any customer in here. You can get a list of orders for any of those customers. So quick recap here of what we did. This is, again, just recapping, it's a really common scenario. Pick lists, dynamic pick lists are one of the most common things that customers use frevvo for. DB connector is not the exclusive way of doing this. You can connect to other data sources like a Google Sheet or a variety of backend systems as well. But in the database connector case, it's really straightforward. Create a query that returns the data that you need. Give it a name, stick it in the database connector configuration. That creates an HTTP mapping. Create a business rule that invokes that HTTP URL, and then parse the results and set up the pick list. It's a very formulaic way. You do it a couple of times, and you will very quickly get the hang of how to create these dynamic pick lists. So it's a very powerful capability, very useful again for users. But that stuff is useful if what you're trying to do is create a single control, like a pick list. Now, what if you have a much more complex, your result set is a much more complex data structure, like the line items for that particular order? So I've got a list of customers. I select a customer. I've got a list of orders for that customer. Now, if I look at the actual order, it has a number of line items. So what do you do? In frevvo, you got to define a query first. So let's first take a look at the query, and let's take a look at it in the database itself. So we need an order number. Make sure 10397 is a valid order, it turns out. So for order number 10397, here's the actual result set. So the result set has a product, quantity, price, description, and MSRP. I guess that's what was in our SQL query. But this particular order has 5 line items. It has these 5 things. This is a model shop, kind of models, classic models. So I bought 5 models of the Titanic, the Queen Mary, etc., etc. Here was the price, the quantity, the description, etc. If you were to run this or look at this in the database connector, you would see an XML document. We'll just get to that in a second over here. You can use a business rule to do this also, but it's tedious. You got to loop through these 5 rows. Then each row itself is an array of values. You've got to loop through the array of values, and then one by one set the value of each control. This is a great example for where XML schema provides a much cleaner, much easier way to use to do this kind of complex initialization in frevvo. So what are the steps? Like everything with the DB connector, first step is to define the query. The next step is to generate an XML schema from the query, upload it into your application, add it as a data source, and add controls for this query, and then finally connect the controls that were automatically generated for you to the database connector, to the database via the connector, and we'll see how to do that. Again, it's an HTTP URL. So first things first, Here's the query. It's called order details by order. We already saw the actual query executing. And as we saw in this particular case, for this particular order, it returned, it returned 5 rows. As I mentioned in the previous slide, then after defining the query, in order to use the XML schema case, you got to first generate a schema. So how do you define how do you generate a schema? Well, in the database connector, you do it by simply the query set, the query, add the word /schema, pass any relevant parameters, and click on it, and you'll see that the database connector has spit out or generated an XML schema for you. The schema is called, has a root element called order details by order. That's just generated from the name of the query. And then you can see down here that it's returning to you this particular order detail. Where is it gone? Order details by order has a max occurs of unbounded, so that we don't know how many rows it'll return. It might return 5 rows, 1 row, 1,000 rows, we don't know. And then each row, if you will, in the result set has a product, which is a string. The max length is 70. This comes from the database, so the database column in there has that configured. It has a quantity, which is an integer, a price, which is a double, a description, which is a string with another max length, and then MSRP, which is itself a double. So the database connector is generating a schema that attempts to respect whatever constraints have been set up in the database by whoever created this table. Okay, so now that we have a schema here, what's the next step in here? It's upload this schema into your form, into your frevvo application, and generate the necessary controls. Unfortunately, at this point in time, this is a manual step. You actually have to download the schema to your disk and generate a file and upload it back into the frevvo application. So I already have that done here to avoid a step in here. Here's this order details by order schema. So let me download that, and we can take a quick look at it. Here's the schema. It's this exact same thing that you saw on the screen in there. Order details by order, max occurs, unbounded, product, quantity, price, description, and MSRP. So now that we have the schema in here, let's go and add it to the form. So let's see, does this one have it already in there? I think this already does. So let's start by creating a copy of this orders by customer form. So what we have here is a form that just has those 2 dynamic pick lists. And what we're going to do is, let's clean that out a little bit. Okay, first thing I'll do here is I'll rename it. Okay, so we've got it. What we're going to do here is add a list of order line items. Now that remember, we generated the schema has already been uploaded to this particular frevvo application. We're going to add the data source for that particular order details by order schema from that schema to this form. So here I click new from XSD under data sources. You see a list of data sources that are available to you. We want order details by order, so I'm going to click plus there and dismiss this box. And here we have that order details by order. Now, if you remember from the schema, and the order details has any number of rows, essentially a representation of the result set. It can have 1 or more rows. Each row has a product, quantity, price, description, and MSRP. Okay. Once we've got the data source added, the next step here really is to add the controls for that data set, or for that data source to the form. You can add them one at a time here, but we're just going to click plus at the very top and add the entire section. So you'll see what got added. It's created a section called order details by order, and then a list of rows underneath. As with everything in frevvo, you can certainly move this. I'm going to move this down here. So I moved this order details by order section below. We really don't need that outer section. So I'll move this row out here, and let's get rid of this. So you'll see it's created a list of controls, product, quantity, price, distributor, sorry, again, maps directly to that XML schema. A plus button here because this is a repeating thing. Now, the one thing here is that this looks a bit cumbersome. It's a little taking up too much space. So let's adjust that a little bit. You can certainly change this. You know, you can. One way to do it is you can make it 3 columns wide. You can change the appearance of any of these controls at will. But what we're going to do instead is we're going to go to the outermost repeat and change that to display it as a table. Much more compact and easier way to display a list of a much more natural way to display the list of line items for a particular order. So what we've done here again is we've gone to the database connector and generated an XML schema. We've added that XML schema to the application as a data source. We've added the data source to the form and then generated controls for that form, which were automatically generated as a repeating session. We've decided that we don't like the repeat. Let's change it into a table. This looks much more compact. And then the last step here really is all we need to do is connect this data source to the query. Now, if you think about it again, the query itself is this query here called order details by order. By now, hopefully this is familiar to you. Connecting any query in the database connector configuration to frevvo involves essentially mapping it to an HTTP URL. Here's the URL, order details by order. The order number is 10397 in this. This is just an example. If you were to execute this query, you see you're going to get an XML document. This XML document conforms to this XML schema, and it represents the data in that result set here that we saw. So you can see it's exactly the same information. Queen Mary, the yacht, Titanic, Constitution, the Mayflower, the same information in that XML document. And what we need to do now is we need to set up this connect the data source that we added to this particular URL. The only difference between these two is that the order number is dynamic using a template. If you remember, this control was called SC. The order control was called SO. Since we know that the name of this control is SO, we're going to go to we're going to click this button here, go to Doc URIs, and click on this Set Document URIs. There are 2 documents in here. One is this default document, which we don't want to touch. The other one is the order details by order. That's the one we want to set up. And in here, we're going to stick that URL in. So what is this URL? It's just database, the query set, the name of the query, and then we're passing the necessary parameters, except that it's dynamic. So this URL will be automatically invoked by the frevvo form, and the section below will automatically be refreshed every time the value of this control changes, which essentially means every time I pick an order number from the list of orders pick list. And the last thing we want to do here is specify the method get, which means that this is going to run the retrieve or the select query. That's all there is to it. Click finish. So now we've created a much more complex form with a built-in data structure that's going to initialize this table. Let's try it out. So again. So you see here the same form. The first query ran. It generated a list of customers. I select a customer. The second query ran and it generated a list of orders and set the list of orders within that SO. And you can see the orders are, here's the description of the order and here's the actual order number. Now I'm going to clear this for clarity here. And when I select an order here, you'll see that the list of line items for that order was displayed in this in the table below. I change the order, you're going to get a different list of line items for that order. So it's pretty simple. There's that query 10397 with those 4 ship models that we've been using all along. Easy as that. You know, one important thing to note here is that we really didn't have to write any code to do this other than those 2 business rules. The entire setup down below where we created this complex table data and handled this complex data structure very easily without writing any code. The dynamic number of rows, the data coming in, automatically refreshing, all that stuff was automatically handled by frevvo. One last thing here is you can certainly change the appearance of this table if you want. For example, I can go here and, I don't know, whatever, make this label red and bold it. I can move the description out to the right, and I can go to the table itself and change the width of that table, of the columns. I have that here. It's easy for me to copy paste this. Change the column width so the table looks a little bit different. None of these visual elements have any impact on the actual data. So I can select that same customer, select that same order, and see the exact same data, except it's automatically placed in the appropriate columns. The plus minus buttons are generated. If I were to delete this, and if I were to click submit, and I had the appropriate update query configured, frevvo would have done the right thing and deleted that particular row. So I don't want to affect the database. I'm not going to do that. So that's a quick look at few things that you can do with frevvo. I guess we already talked about this particular one. You can see how the form was automatically updated in this case. So that gave you that was a quick introduction. So we only have about 8 to 10 minutes left here. I really wanted to quickly give you a look at the available resources in here. We have a number of resources available in frevvo here. There's a tutorial on our website. It goes through this. First off, the first couple of examples go through exactly what I've shown over here, but then it also gives you a look at how you can create a new order, add order details, and update existing records. Really useful resource, learning the database connector. There are training classes available as well. You can go to our website, click Get Help and Help in Training. I think one of the mini trainings, rotational mini trainings, does have database connector in it, right? Courtney's nodding. So yeah, there are. If you go here, right now there doesn't happen to be one scheduled. That means there probably was one very recently, but there will be one scheduled soon.
You can request to have that class.
Okay, and you can also always put in a request to schedule that class. And then there's lots of detailed documentation on the database connector. How do you install it? Database connector, stored procedures, and also security. Security is a very important aspect as well. Database connector has a lot of built-in security. Obviously, runs on SSL. You can assign query key attributes, essentially a password to each query, and it also has built-in automatic SQL injection protection. And then finally, just generic help. You can always go to our website, frevvo's website. Go to oops, wrong URL there. Go to our website here under Get Help. There are a number of examples. In fact, this database connector examples are right here. You can try the forms out yourself. We have a large number of videos, quick product demonstrations to examples to detailed form and workflow tutorials. We obviously have webinars. You're on one. And there are a number of ebooks and infographics as well, and an extensive support site as well, where you can create a ticket, you can read forums, FAQs, ask questions, and so on and so forth. So thank you very much. That was, I know that was a little bit quick, but hopefully tried to give you an idea of what are some of the things you can do with the database connector. It's a really, really powerful and very popular feature of frevvo. So we have a few minutes, hopefully some time for questions, and Courtney's nodding that there are indeed some questions, so fire away.
Yep, so somebody would like to know, is there any way to create libraries of connections, queries, business rules, controls for reuse on multiple forms?
So the question is there a way to create libraries of things, queries, right, controls, etc., for reuse in multiple forms? The answer is yes. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. The queries obviously are created in the database connector configuration, and they can be reused across any number of forms. And then there's also the ability to create what we call custom controls. So you can create, for example, this particular control here, selecting the customer from the list. There's this custom palette in here, and you can go in here and drag and drop and publish this control as a template, and reuse that control in other forms. The exact same control can be used in the form. If you want the control to I believe if you want to publish the control together with the associated business rule, you're going to have to put it inside a panel, and a panel is essentially an invisible component in the form. You can also publish entire forms as templates. So the form might have a might be a complex data structure, URIs, doc-URIs, all kinds of stuff set up. Then you can publish the entire form as a template and use that form as a starting point as well. So there are a variety of ways in which you can publish, you can set this up.
And then you mentioned the rules as a way to get the dynamic options for selection control. Is there a way to do it without all those business rules, maybe showing them the dynamic options in the drop-down property? The options source URL? Control? Just maybe showing.
Yes, there is a way to do that. Instead of using a business rule, you can use this thing called web service and actually set a URL, and this URL will point to the database connector query, and then you've got to set up a value and a label binding for it, which means what's the value, from whatever that URL returns, which element represents the value of the control and which element represents the label of the control. I've actually never done this, so I'm not gonna try it, but I'm sure it works.
Yeah, and
that's true. That would be that would be a way of doing it without having to write a business rule at all. Mm-hmm. We should write an article about this.
Yeah. Of course, can this be used? Can the database connector connect to multiple databases, or are you limited to one?
Right. The question was, can the database connector be used to connect to multiple databases? And the answer is absolutely. You can have a single database connector. The configuration can have any number of query sets, and each query set, as you saw, has its own configuration for the database itself. It can connect to different tables within the same physical database and can connect to completely different physical databases distributed anywhere in the world that are accessible to the database connector, obviously.
And then if I have a cloud tenant, can I use the database connector?
If I have a cloud tenant, yes, right. So yes, you can certainly use the database connector. The only caveat is that you do need to run the database connector somewhere. It's pretty easy to do. The main reason for that is nobody ever exposes their actual SQL database to the internet. So we need to be able to run the database connector somewhere where it has access to the database. You can run SQL queries against the database. But the database connector then is the component that's accessible to frevvo Cloud. So that's absolutely possible. We have a lot of customers who are indeed using frevvo in the cloud, connecting to the database connector in their DMZ, which then talks to the SQL, which then talks to the actual SQL server or MySQL or whatever database is behind the scenes.
Okay, and here's one last one here. How are unforeseen communication issues between the form server and the DB connector dealt with? Do we need to be concerned about the possibility of a post or a put hitting the database, being processed, but the form not knowing whether the post or put was successful? So I guess maybe troubleshooting connection issues between the database and frevvo. So maybe a little bit about the error handling and the submissions. If a submission is not
right, no, I understand. So I think the basic question was error handling. How does the form need to, or does the form designer need to worry about situations where errors happen? I'm not 100% sure of the answer, how people actually deal with that. I know that there's a lot of automation within the database connector itself there, so you would obviously have these things running transactionally. So if something fails and the transaction fails to commit, you're not going to modify the database. The database connector, I believe, also has an ability to send a specific HTTP code back to the form. So when the doc URI, for example, runs an update, and let's say user clicks submit, and that's going to update something in your database. If there's a failure, it has the ability, I believe, to re-render the form with an error message of your choosing on the screen as well. The submission itself, if any of the doc URIs going outbound doc URIs fail, the submission itself will be marked in error as well. But I know I wave my hands there a little bit because I don't really know the precise answer. It'd be a good idea to submit that question to us through our support channel. Perhaps we can get you a little bit better answer I apologize, I don't know the exact answer. Is that it? All right. Well, thank you very much for attending. As I mentioned, there are a large number of resources available. If there's anything else we can answer or help you with, please don't hesitate to reach out to us via any of these channels. Go to our website and click on the contact link. Send an email to info@frevvo.com or pick up the phone and call the number you see on your screen. Thanks again for attending, and have a great day.